Hello, and welcome to the Justice and Coffee podcast, the podcast where we discuss all things justice over coffee with a special guest. And as it's International Anti-Slavery Day today, we thought we'd do something a little different. So I've asked Ryna Sherazi from Anti-Slavery International, quite possibly the oldest international anti-slavery NGO in existence, to come on and take us through some of the fundamentals around this issue that lots of us are talking about today. So let me welcome new and existing listeners to the podcast and to Modern Slavery 101 with Ryna Sherazi talking justice over a delicious cup of brewed herbs and nuts. Are you ready?
Ready, yeah. I've got half a cup of cold coffee here. Coffee, not coffee, I'm afraid.
Coffee, not coffee.
Coffee, not coffee.
What's that?
It's something called tea-chino. Do you know what tea-chino is?
No.
Oh, I feel blasphemous coming onto your podcast.
Go on then. Tell me what tea-chino is.
It's other brands are available, obviously. It's a coffee substitute.
Is it made out of mushrooms?
Oh no, that sounds interesting. No, It's made out of herbs.
Oh.
Yeah, sort of roasted herbs and nuts and things like that. And I started on it a few years ago and I struggled with coffee and I drink that. And then occasionally, when I'm feeling a little full of myself, I'll stick a spoon of real ground coffee in there as well. Knocking it out the park. Yeah. So and then I put oat milk in. It's almost like hence coffee, not coffee.
Wow.
Gets me through an afternoon.
It never fails to surprise me hearing different people's hot drink preferences, hot beverage preferences, and they're all so unique. But that's a new one. So coffee, not coffee. It's a variety of ground sort of spices and herbs and
nuts and
wow,
seeds that I don't know.
No caffeine in that.
No caffeine, and then I just have a little bit of oat milk in there as well. Yeah. How do you take your coffee, Bryn?
Oh well, since we've started, and I'll let you know,
yes.
we have started now. I'm a black coffee drinker guy. I like to describe myself as a purist. Yeah, let's just cut all of the additives out and have it as it was made. Try and distinguish the flavor from the original coffee bean. But you know what? I also sometimes struggle with digestion, having had too many coffees in my lifetime. So I try not to drink too much on an empty belly. And that's exactly what I did this morning. I was in a fluster, woke up, slept through an alarm. First thing I did was without having anything in some cereal or toast or anything, but bowl full of essentially acid, what coffee is. And I'm sort of feeling a little bit, ooh, I wish I'd have had some toast first. So I'm also drinking a non-coffee. I'm drinking a green tea.
Oh, nice. Classy.
I mean, we've lost half our audience already, but why don't I start by welcoming you to the podcast? It's so good, Ryna, to have you on. So thank you for coming on. I was going to, my opener would have been your coffee habits, but we were talking kind of off air about it. That now becomes on air about it. So we know your coffee routine, but why don't you start then by telling me a little bit about yourself, how you got involved in working in the anti-trafficking sector?
Yeah, well, thanks, Bryn. It's such a delight to be on the podcast with you. We're fans of the podcast, so here at Anti-Slavery International, so great to be here. So I have been knocking around really in the social justice sector, chipping away at my little bit as a communications and fundraising professional for 24 years now. So I started off in the water and sanitation sector, and it was actually a sort of a chance encounter. I was seconded out to India working with WaterAid, and I went to this extraordinary centre in a place called Lucknow in Uttar Pradesh for people who were HIV positive. A lot of them had been recently diagnosed as such, and I was there to understand the sort of new water and sanitation provisions that Watertrade had worked with them on. And I sat down and I talked to a lady who was sitting on a bed with her toddler, and she was actually, like me, she was pregnant. So I was 6 or 7 months pregnant at the time. I was actually just overcoming dengue fever as well. So I felt particularly, well, a bit stupid actually for a number of reasons, but also very vulnerable. And it was this frame of mind. I was sat down with this woman, and she just taught me that like my problems were nothing. They were, I had enormous amounts of privilege because she was married to a migrant worker who was working in Mumbai at the time for 7 or 8 years. She lived in the village with her in-laws, and she had a 4-year-old, I think it was, who she left at home with neighbours because she was feeling unwell for several months and wanted to get a diagnosis and get some treatment. That morning, she had been to the doctor and finally got a diagnosis that it was HIV. The stigma that exists everywhere actually, but it's very, very acute, particularly for women in places like northern India. She was just sort of reeling from this diagnosis, felt she couldn't go home straight away, heard about this centre in Lucknow, walked for 7.5 hours, and sat there and just was looking for some support, which she got from the centre. But the striking thing there was that she said, I can't go back home because the stigma is so deep. I will just be ostracized. I went away from that, obviously very moved by her story, but it really stayed with me because I thought, well, then, one, what are the options for her daughter? Her daughter is now without the care. She has parents, obviously, but if mum is, cannot go back, then those social protections aren't there. But also, what are the options now for this woman who will be, wherever she goes, I guess, unless she gets the support and the treatment she needs, will be discriminated against because of that diagnosis, which got me really sort of interested in this issue of these very, very, we use the word marginalised a lot in the social justice sector, but deeply, deeply marginalised by, communities. The social norms exist, are so strong. And those social norms also, there are very harmful social norms in places like the UK as well. It's not just in Lucknow in North India. And so it was that really that got me very interested. And then I found myself working and living in Kathmandu in Nepal a couple of years later, and I ended up doing quite a lot of work on the issue of child trafficking into orphanages, which was an issue that we lobbied hard with the organisation I worked with there. We lobbied hard the US TIP, US Trafficking in Persons Department, to recognise that as a form of trafficking, considering the harm it does to children.
Wow.
That's what sort of eventually brought me here to Anti-Slavery International.
So trafficking into orphanages. So one of the things I wanted to do with this podcast is sort of go back to basis, not spend too long on any one area, which is what we have done and what we'll continue to do. But a few people have asked, where do I start with this issue? If I wanted to come on board, if I wanted to build my knowledge around modern slavery, where do I start, or which podcast would you recommend? And we've gone all across the board really in looking at trafficking. So what I wanted to do with this one is kind of go back to basics. But before we do, since you've mentioned it, it hasn't actually come up. I'm not sure we've talked about orphanage trafficking yet. So I wonder, with all of that said, before we get started on the basics, as briefly and succinctly as you think you can manage it, because people will be really surprised at that. But is there such a thing as children being trafficked into orphanages? Tell us just briefly about what that is.
Sure. So it's something that I should say there are far more significant experts on than I am these days. But yes, there is, in places like where I was working in Nepal, in Cambodia, I think there's issues in Thailand. There are, and across some countries in Africa as well, and South America, there are orphanages, children's homes that are effectively run like commercial enterprises. And this comes from a sort of system where there hasn't been enough sort of focus on keeping families together, which is the best thing. Families staying together healthy families staying together, children staying with healthy families leads to the best outcomes for children, first of all. In Nepal, how that manifested was, it's a country that's quite aid dependent. It's also a country that has a lot of tourism. And so when tourists would come over to Nepal, they were sold a trek or a cultural visit, and also a few days volunteering at an orphanage for which they would pay. What that led to was a sort of supply and demand problem. People going, oh, actually, I can make a bit of money from the tourists here. I'll import some children from the local villages who will come to the towns, and they'll be in this orphanage and we'll provide them with schooling and whatnot. But actually what would happen was that these children were often coerced and brought over to these orphanages. Their links with their families were completely gone, which meant that things like local languages, local traditions were lost. Families were often desperately sort of searching across the country for these children that they thought were just going to school for a couple of years and then coming back and getting, coming back with better opportunities. And effectively children were being used as sort of poverty commodities. So some of the work that I worked on then with a small organisation called Next Generation Nepal helped to sort of tackle the issue on the ground, sort of actually helping to rescue children who are in orphanages that are particularly abusive and exploitative, and helping to find their families and reintegrate them, supporting the families so that the children were not re-trafficked and the families and communities were strong, and advocacy to make sure that this as a business model was no longer viable.
Thank you for sharing that. I hadn't warned you that was something I was going to ask you about. So okay. Thanks for mentioning that. There is, I think, a growing awareness of, I've heard it termed as voluntourism, of the potential ill effects of that, albeit with people creating that supply and demand issue that you mentioned with the greatest of intentions of going, well, I've got a gap year, I want to do something good. And I think it's something you've got to handle quite carefully, actually. You don't want to deter people from volunteering for great NGOs and organizations. I don't know how you got started, but that was my experience of doing volunteering overseas when I was 18 for 4 or 5 months. And that got me started, I suppose. And that will be the same for a lot of people working in the aid sector or the charity sector. So you don't want to start to criminalize that, but it is being conscientious of what that might be. And of course, the situations that have mutated to try and profit from people's goodwill. And there's lots more, many other examples of that. But let's park that one for now and go back to Modern Slavery 101 with Ryna Sherazi. So I've asked our followers today if you've got any questions about this, like what are the basic questions you'd like to know? And they've responded as you might expect. But why don't we start by people saying, my impression of slavery was something a couple hundred years ago with the African slave trade, people coming across the colonialization of the United States, the sugar trade, cotton and coffee, cobalt, these commodities requiring people to farm them, and slave conditions in which to do so efficiently, etc., etc., etc. How can that still be happening today? Surely that is in the past, right?
Wrong, I'm afraid. So yes, it's complete. Well, first of all, when we hear the word slavery, it conjures up, like you say, all of those images and more, Bryn. It conjures up a lot of emotion as well, of course, and we're still dealing with the kind of repercussions of that trade. So it's probably worth noting that Anti-Slavery International has been around for a very long time. We're 183 years old now this year, and we were formed, or a version of us was formed as a consequence of the campaign to abolish the transatlantic slave trade. The Act came into Parliament in 1807, and the campaign then went, right, okay, well, we've managed to get this far. We've got to make slavery, this sort of what's often called chattel slavery, we need to abolish it in every country in the world. That this organisation has existed to do that and end it in its forms, in all forms, everywhere in the world. So it was 1981 when the last country abolished modern slavery. So I don't know how old you are, Bryn, but you're probably a little younger than me. I'm 46, so that was in my lifetime, and that is mind-blowing that in my lifetime there were countries where it was legal to own and exploit another person, another human being.
What was that country, out of interest?
It was Mauritania.
Mauritania being the last country. Wow, fascinating.
Yeah. So it's worth also knowing that even though slavery has been abolished in every country in the world, recent estimates just from a few weeks ago tell us that there are 50 million people in modern slavery, what we now term modern slavery today. That's the modern contemporary manifestations of slavery. So let's talk about definitions here. Now, there are all sorts of sort of legal definitions, but I'm not going to kind of bamboozle anyone with those. But put simply, we define modern slavery as when an individual is exploited by someone else or others for personal or commercial gain. I think we can all agree that that is a fundamental wrong. And I think we can all agree that 50 million people is 50 million people too many. And, you know, one person in modern slavery, frankly, is one person too many. So just to give a sense of what that means in everyday terms that may be understandable to everyone, is some of the forms that modern slavery takes. So you've mentioned the term trafficking. I've also mentioned the term child trafficking as well in this conversation so far. And trafficking is, excuse me, is a sort of, if you like, it comes under the umbrella term of modern slavery. So people may have heard of people being trafficked into sexual exploitation. They may have heard of forced labour, people being forced to work for no or far too little pay. People who are in what's called bonded labour, so they may be bonded, or they may be, if you like, sort of stuck in a situation because of things like a debt bondage. They are bound to a debt that they have to pay off for the rest of their lives, which sometimes is a completely fictitious debt, or it's a debt with, you know, terms that an individual or a family doesn't understand. For Anti-Slavery International, we've worked with people for whom that debt is generational. So, you know, it's not, if you think about the connections with historical slavery, you know, there are people who were enslaved and their children were enslaved. It's not actually, you know, in exploitative terms, actually terrifically different. The mechanism, the tool to exploit people is just changing. Forced marriage is also a form of modern slavery, and also exploitation in criminal activity. So, for example, in the UK, we are tackling an issue of often young people who are exploited in trafficking drugs, growing drugs, which means that they're effectively stuck between a rock and a hard place, or the sort of proverbial shit sandwich where, you know, they are being exploited by exploiters. They are forced to do something criminal. Therefore, seeking help from authorities means that they're much more likely to be treated first as a criminal and second as a victim. So I hope that helps to just sort of paint the picture of what that looks like in an everyday term. The other thing that struck me when I was reading the latest statistics was I was thinking, gosh, 50 million people, how do I picture 50 million people? I've never been anywhere. I don't think I've ever been anywhere where I could see 50 million people. And someone said to me, well, it's kind of about 1 in 150. And at the time my son was, well, actually this is when the last estimates came out, but my son was having a bit of a double-decker bus phase, I think most young children do. And I was like, oh, how many double-decker buses is that? And I happen to know that in London, a double-decker bus largely seats 60 people. So, you know, 60 people, it's effectively like one person in 3 double-decker buses that aren't even completely full who are in modern slavery. And when you think about that, you just think, my goodness, this is actually closer than you actually originally think when you see the figures at first. Yeah,
that's an interesting point of reference. One person in not so full 3 double buses. Very helpful. No, that's great. Thank you for running us through some of those things. So for those who are possibly sort of want to drill down a little bit and say, well, hang about, I know lots of people that feel economically exploited by their employer. They get paid a very little amount of money, and somebody at the top gets paid a very big amount of money, and that's crap. Is that slavery too? Where do you draw the line?
Yeah, so there is something called a continuation of forced labour, And this is something we work with a lot, because it helps us to identify, if you like, the kind of slippery slope of people being forced into some form of exploitative work. When someone's sort of freedom is limited, when someone's is being exploited or harmed, there are usually patterns that we see. So, for example, if we're working with a company and we can see that actually parts of their business have a really dire sort of health and safety provision, it's one of many indicators of whether actually those workers are being treated as they should do in terms of their kind of legal rights. And so it's when we kind of look at it in the whole, we have to identify, like, are these workers, when we're all largely workers, are their rights being respected within the workplace? Have they got the freedom to move workplaces as well? That's a really key issue, particularly in the UK. There's been quite a lot of talk about things like tied visas, seasonal visas, and so on, where you would be tied to an employer and could not leave.
Yeah, I think that word freedom is key, isn't it? That word freedom. And you talk about seasonal workers. I know there's a system still in countries in the Middle East. I think it's been banned in Qatar fairly recently. I don't know if that's accurate or not. I know there's been a lot of attention about the upcoming World Cup, and I think it's something like 6,000 people that believed to have died in the construction of the infrastructure to allow that World Cup to take place in that country. A system called kafala. Are you aware of kafala?
Kafala system, yes.
Yeah. So and that's where they don't have that freedom, and where the employer has that control, and their passports and bank accounts are controlled. And just, of course, what a perfect situation that creates for slavery and exploitation. But that does still happen here in the UK, right? I mean, okay, we don't necessarily have the kafala system in place here in official terms, but we'll have situations where workers are brought over, where their passports are being managed by somebody else and confiscated, where their paying conditions fall far below what is legal, if not outright debt bondage slavery. When I was a police officer, and that wasn't that long ago, I still went to cases where there was a Vietnamese teenager sleeping in a sleeping bag under a staircase in a converted house on a council estate that had been turned into a cannabis factory, and his job was to water the plants 24 hours a day, and living off pot noodles and nothing else, with no mobile phone, no passport, no independent access to money, no means of leaving the premises, etc., etc. And yet he'd still get nicked as a conspirator or involved in the supply of a Class C, a controlled substance, or whatever. That was not that long ago. We were treating people like that as criminals, rather than going, well, maybe this person is a victim of modern slavery. So why don't we bring it to the UK? Let's have a look at things in the UK. Does it really happen here, and what should we be looking out for?
Yeah, you're absolutely spot on. It's all very well thinking about it as far away, but it actually happens in, slavery is on our streets. It's on our towns and our cities and our villages. And, I talked about the global number of 50 million earlier, but the most recent statistics from the UK government, which we in this country measure every quarter, puts the official figures at around 13,000 people in slavery today. It's worth noting that experts are pretty comfortable publishing the number of being over 100,000 in slavery today. It's just that, as the example you use is a good one, it's the fear sometimes of being able to report, of being able to find help, of worrying that the fear that you would be penalized by the state when it should be supporting you and protecting you. It's one of the reasons why Anti-Slavery International, actually, we focus on what we call the system change needed to tackle modern slavery. Just look at it as a numbers game for a minute. If you're talking about 50 million, 13,000, 100,000, organisations that provide and services that provide the sort of support to those survivors, hugely important. We could not do without that. We need that work in place. But the traffickers, if the system allows that trafficking to happen, if it allows that modern slavery to happen, there's just going to be another vulnerable person that's going to take their places, that's going to be sleeping in that sleeping bag under the stairs. So if we're really serious about ending slavery, and we we are, you know, we have a very stated aim of freedom from slavery from everyone, everywhere, always, then we need to be focused on that sort of what we call systems change. Now, system change can feel like a bit of a jargonistic term, so I'm just going to kind of break that down a bit here. And it's also something that we in our world we talk about a lot in the issue of human rights and modern slavery, in social justice generally, we talk about quite a lot. But to me, what that means is a sort of addressing like those underlying structures, the root causes that mean that boy under the stairs is there in the first place, that mean to the boy under the stairs just feels too fearful to seek help. The reason that boy under the stairs doesn't know that he is in something called modern slavery and that is wrong. So that could be discrimination. It could be a poverty that they're trying to escape from. It can be that there's a lack of legal protection. It can be that there are social norms that means that actually the other people on that estate aren't really looking out for that kid, because they're like, oh, it's just some, you know, kid from another country that we don't really care about or some layabout. They're the things that we're trying to tackle, because if we don't dismantle those, if we don't really ask ourselves the difficult questions about why that's happening, we're probably just not going to get anywhere. And so, you know, for us, it sort of takes 4 or 5 different forms, and that's first and foremost, making sure the law is effective enough to protect people. If the law's not there, then we've got no one really to hold to account. That we already see, as you know, from your previous work, prosecution rates are horrendously low. You know, for such a heinous crime, horrendously low. So we need to make sure that those laws are in place, they're implemented, everyone knows them, all across that sort of value chain, if you like, of organisations and services that work with that legislation. We need to make sure that what we call the movement, the sort of the businesses, the grassroots organisations, the activists, the campaigners, the individuals in our communities that can want to do something, are sort of allies in other countries, international organisations, that we are collectively a strong movement, that we are aligned, that there is. And it's really, really hard because there are so many issues at the moment. You know, we've got, you know, huge amounts of kind of conflict around the world, where most countries are dealing with some degree of economic instability. We're in our country, at least, we're dealing with, you know, what Brexit means to the country. So there's so many things to consider, but we have to make sure that we are absolutely, the movement to end slavery is absolutely aligned, and it's strong and it's effective, and we all have a part to play in that. We've got to make sure that the voice of those people who are affected by modern slavery are a part of leading the charge. It can be very common to see that there are experts talking about people who are in slavery, and it can, you know, translating that is not always the most effective thing to do, but also, you know, there are people who've lived through the system who can actually talk about like what worked for them and what didn't, and that, you know, gives us that really valuable information. And Slavery International was part of the part of the anti-trafficking monitoring group, published a report earlier in the year, which was designed by people with lived experience, and, you know, their experiences of the system in the UK and what was working and what was not for them. So it's that sort of work that we need to be able to kind of elevate, really. Also, something that often isn't talked about, but we think is really, really important, and is a big part of my job as Director of Communications, is how we frame the issue of modern slavery. It's very easy to think, as you said right at the beginning, to think it's somewhere over there. It's, you know, thousands of miles away in Cambodia or Kathmandu in my early career, or hundreds and hundreds of years ago, and we don't really need to think about it. But as we've demonstrated today, it's on our streets, it's in our communities. There are people who are being victimised, and if we're not clear as professionals, if we're not clear about that is happening, and that actually we do need to care about it, and that there are child labour, you know, child slavery in the clothes that we're wearing, that is unacceptable. Because actually when we get public polling data, it shows that people do think it's it's not an acceptable thing. It's just that most people don't know what to do about it. So framing the issue, making it relevant, making it so that it is not this sort of technical legalistic thing that happens and someone might be dealing with somewhere in, over in some technical space, but actually it is a concern that we all need to be aware of, that there are helplines available, that there are signs that we can look out for, whether it's in our communities, in our schools, in the businesses that we work for, and so on. So that's quite a kind of important part of how we see affecting that change.
Great. What I was going to close with is just asking how we can help. If someone was listening and going, okay, so how do I respond? What's the first thing you'd suggest? But you've kind of led on to it there. But what else would you say?
Today, the 18th of October, is Anti-Slavery Day. It's an annual day, and it's a really important time for us to raise awareness. If you're, on social media, or if you're talking to your friends this evening or family members, if you're on your WhatsApp groups, this is the information that you could be sharing today and other times throughout the year. There are sort of two main, very simple things that we're asking people to do. One is to learn more about the issue of modern slavery. There is, on Anti-Slavery International's channels, there is a very short blog on the 5 things you can do today to help end slavery. One of those is spotting the signs of slavery. So, having that as a guide, through the rest of your life as you go about your day-to-day work and play is such a valuable thing. And it means that we can all be active participants in ending modern slavery once and for all. So the second thing that folks can do this Anti-Slavery Day today is to sign a petition. It only takes a few minutes, and that petition is calling on the government to introduce what we call import bans. This is something that's worked very successfully in the US, and if you are someone who is worried that the things that you buy, services that you procure, might be made with forced labour or child labour, they might be made by people who've been exploited, then this is a way to show that you don't think that's acceptable. And we're calling on the UK government to introduce these bans to ensure that goods that are made with forced labour are not imported into the UK. That petition can be accessed from a website called Coalition to Stop Slavery. So lots on social today from the Coalition. That's a group of a whole number of large and small organisations that are pushing for these changes. And you'll also see on there a little guide on how you yourself can spot the signs of modern slavery and seek help for people.
Perfect. Thank you. That's helpful. It's always helpful to have a response, a call to action. So thank you for sharing that. We said we'd keep it brief, so I'm not gonna ask you any more at this stage. Maybe we'll come bring you back on and we'll have a look at some of these issues in a bit more detail. But for now, thank you so much for coming on to the Justice and Coffee podcast and sharing with us today. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Bryn, for having us. It's been just such a delightful conversation to have this with you.
Very welcome, very welcome. Keep doing the good work and keep drinking interesting hot beverages.
Not tea, not coffee.
Take care.
Okay. Thanks so much, Bryn.
So thank you to those of you who messaged in on our socials with some of those questions. I hope that was helpful. I can certainly see how there's room for confusion when thinking about this issue and our response to it. If we're addressing, let's say, access to clean water, we build wells. Or access to education, we build schools. We fund educational materials. We sponsor teachers' salaries. To malaria, we provide mosquito nets. We fund inoculations and medication. Combating modern slavery requires a whole variety of responses. Some of them are systemic, like Ryna said, and exist on a state and governmental level. And that's why it's important to keep modern slavery on the political agenda. And some of it comes down to where we shop, what we put in the trolley, learning where our goods come from, spotting signs of slavery in our communities and reporting our concerns. The good news is you can be part of the change. It does involve you. Check out Anti-Slavery International at their website, www.antislavery.org, and on social media at Anti-Slavery International. And like Ryna suggested, go to the Anti-Slavery Coalition website today and sign the petition calling our government to ban imports from countries that profit from forced labour. Their website is coalitiontostopslavery.org. I'll put a link to these in the show notes. If you want to go a little deeper and you're a new listener to the podcast, why not take a look at some of our previous episodes where we discuss the topic of modern slavery and human trafficking with a variety of specialists from around the world. This podcast was produced by Blue Bear Coffee. You can find out about our mission to fight slavery through coffee at our website, bluebearcoffee.com. So get out there, use your voice, share with your network, and together we can put an end to this great injustice. Thanks for listening this Anti-Slavery Day 2022. Peace.